Thanks 5 Points for having me. It's always a pleasure to be working with 5 Points because of all the incredible work they do. And it's a great pleasure to be with you guys tonight and talk about your work. I'm going to be very brief. My role tonight is going to be a moderator, and I'm mostly going to keep time and just feed the artists with some questions. And because so much of the work, one show in particular, is about process, I thought that we could focus tonight's talk on process. As an artist myself, there's always there's the making of the work, and then there's all of the chaos. There's the work that's made, and then there's all of the chaos that goes into making the work, right? And that process is often filled with mystique, and it can be complex. And I think that it'll be really great for us to let the artists tonight share with us their process with a complex multitude of processes. So what's going to happen right now is we're going to go for 2 minutes with each artist. They'll go ahead and just give you an overview of the work in the show or anything that they want to share with you. Then we'll jump into some questions that I'll feed the artists and keep some time. And then we will take some questions the last 15, 20 minutes or so. And I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. So Kevin, do you want to start with a couple minutes to share with us your work?
Sure. Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Carl. And I'd like to thank 5 Points for hosting this event and the show. It's a really fantastic show. If people haven't gotten there in person, I had a great time looking around there last weekend. So I'm a still life photographer by trade and by passion, and not really by choice. It's what I have to do. Photography occupies two very specific roles in my life. What I do in the studio is construct and build and manipulate sets to photograph in order to say things that I need to say or to explore ideas that I have. The second function photography plays in my life is obsessively documenting my family and my travels and the adventures I go on and the silly little things that catch my attention every day. The work that's in this show is from my body of work, which I call the backwards, which is my attempt to mix those two kinds of photography together, to take photographs that I take on a daily basis, things of travels, landscapes, things outside the studio, and think about what I can communicate with them in a still life setting. So the work that you'll see of mine in the show are photographs of photographs in various ways. I've turned printed photographs into still life subject matter. And what this process became about to me is memory and how seeing these moments printed on paper differ from the experience of living them. And this led to me really diving into the idea of how we store memories, how they exist inside us. And to me, I see a very heavy analog with photography, how we store photographs, cataloging them, packing them away, misremembering them, finding a use for them later on. So if I had to kind of summarize the work of mine in the show, they're photographs of photographs that deal with how I imagine memory functioning and how different memories have meant different things to me and how I've attempted to communicate that by setting up something in the studio to take a picture.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Max.
Sorry. Hi there, my name is Max Seinfeld. I'm the director of Sugar Maple Center for Creative Arts in New York and a full-time studio artist in South Windsor, Connecticut. I create small abstract sculptures that examine the interplay of contrasting relationships, such as the slight movement of a solid material or a coarse texture that looks soft. Highlighting these elements, such as line, color, and texture, allows me to create a sense of tension. And the interaction of artificial and natural color creates a sense of play that is drawn from observations in contemporary media, such as the quality of a color pink in a bubblegum advertisement or the allure of a sexy red Cadillac. In this show, I have two bodies of work. I have several color fields which serve as a feast for the eyes, creating a reflecting pool to the tangible desires. Like Narcissus and his reflection, the eye is seduced by line, color, and pattern pulled from specific references. The two other pieces are from a series called Last Text, and those are about a text message that I wish I could have sent but didn't have the chance. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. Will Holub.
Will, unmute.
I never thought I'd be that guy. I've seen it so much in these meetings. I started making textual abstract paintings using paper as a low relief, tactile material on their surfaces back in the 1980s during the AIDS epidemic in New York City. Prior to that, I had been making figurative work, and it simply I wasn't able to respond to the tragedies that were occurring all around me with figurative work. So I, through trial and error, began to tear sheets of marked paper up and glue them to surfaces. I suppose it was, in retrospect now I can see, I was tearing things apart and putting them back together again in a new and strengthened way. I'm not the only artist that did that, but it was new to me. The work on display at 5 Points currently was made in 2003 approximately, when I was living in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. Those years were very fertile for me there. And I had started in New Mexico right after the 9/11 attacks with unseen imagery. In other words, I used sea prints, which I tore into pieces and put and glued image side down. The idea was to let the charge of the imagery, which only I knew about, animate the works. The work at 5 Points brought imagery, photographic imagery in particular, back into play through transfer images, through sea prints of my own, through cardstock laser prints, which I would paint on and splatter with paint and glue in these grid formations. They're particularly relevant now simply because they speak to, again, a fracturing that I have attempted to heal in a way, I suppose. Anyway, you're back.
Ta-da. Thanks, Will. Thanks for sharing. Erin, you want to share with us just a 2-minute overview of the work that you're sharing with everyone at 5 Points?
Sure, thank you. Hi, my name's Erin. I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia. I moved to Connecticut to go to graduate school at UConn. Actually, it was sort of in grad school when this whole body of work started, which was back in 2017, even though I didn't really paint the ones that are in the show or most of the series until after I graduated. I had come off another body of work. I tend to work in, I'm mostly a painter, and everything that I'm doing tends to be painting adjacent in some kind of way, but I draw all the time and I have other ways that I work as well. So I had come off of this drawing installation performance piece, and I really wanted to get into painting again. And I was looking through a Guston book who I had fallen in love with as a kid in Virginia and Richmond at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And I thought, well, what if I just approach it like, because I'm in grad school and thinking about influences. And I'm like, well, what if I just approach it like, if I'm like this lovesick teenager and I'm just going to do everything he says that I've read. This is so dumb, but this is kind of what my thought process was. So I was reading this book of essays that he had, and he gave this list of artists. And I went and got the whole list of books, brought them back. And one of them were these Last Flowers of Manet. And so I actually spent most of 2017 repainting these flower paintings. And then when that kind of just didn't work, although I learned a lot, I ended up planting a garden at the grad studios, and the work changed because of the garden. But these are all the paintings that kind of came out of that, and my love of Guston and painting are in this kind of series. So that's kind of where they came from.
Thank you. Eleanor. Hey, Eleanor.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Sabin. I think I'm a little bit of an outlier in this conversation because I am not on the East Coast. I live and work in Colorado. I'm the foundations coordinator at the University of Northern Colorado, and I also teach in the art and design department there. The work that I have at 5 Points, I'm actually really excited to have in the gallery. It's 9 drawings from a series that I've been referring to as Ground Cover, but the series has continued actually for several years now, so I'm not exactly sure when it will be finished, but it constitutes a pretty large body of work. My work is often between drawing and sculpture, and I'll work on sculptures and drawings simultaneously. But the forms that the ground cover drawings take are mostly pretty zoomed in views of natural landscapes, leaf litter, plants, sort of sticks, rocks, all of the good stuff, drawn in pen and ink with then airbrushed, almost like Technicolor or sort of digitally colored elements superimposed over those landscape scenes. So what I'm aiming for in the series, this is sort of synchronism, right? Where you're looking at the scene, but you can't fully see the entire scene laid out in front of you because the scene is occupying a sort of different spatial dimension than the colored overlaid elements on top. And so for me, drawing and sculpture are still really intertwined because it's all about space and it's all about place and setting. So thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Eleanor. John. Hey, John.
Hi. Hi, my name is John Gintoff. My background is in photography. I have an MFA in photography, but when I had my MFA thesis exhibit, I decided to do an installation instead of just showing straight photographs on the wall. So the whole gallery was filled with, on one wall, a wallpaper that I had made from one of my images, and then I put the work on top of the wallpaper. There were other three-dimensional aspects. There was a veil of plastic sheeting that was stretched across the ceiling of the gallery, and in the plastic sheeting were suspended different photographs that I had taken, postcards that I had found, and I find myself constantly changing from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. So the pieces that are in the exhibit currently are three-dimensional pieces that are more like three-dimensional collages. They are made from photographs that I have taken or I've stolen from the internet. And during one of these episodes, when I become tired of doing two-dimensional work, I decided I would take some of my older photographs and see if I could just make them into something three-dimensional. So I took 4 photographs, wrapped some packing tape around them, and the first collaged sculpture was born. From there, I decided to become a little bit more design oriented. So I wanted to create objects that had feet and sort of arms and became a little bit more anthropomorphic. So the pieces that are in the show stretch from the initial imagery, which was the sort of 4 photographs put together. So the one in the corner that has this sort of extended neck on it is one of the earlier ones. there's another one in the window, and that one is has books used as a pedestal. So I decided I was going to start making some sculptures that incorporated books as well as the photographs that were twisted and bent and taped together. So I went to Savers, one of my favorite stores, and discovered a lot of books, but I also discovered a whole series of small Shakespearean books. So there were the tragedies, the comedies, the poems, everything. So I bought all the books. So incorporated in the pieces in the gallery, a lot of them have Shakespearean books in them. And right now I'm working on two-dimensional work, and I'm starting to collage a lot of images together, and I'm using a drawing tool and drawing Russian words onto the photographs. But enjoy what you see at the gallery.
Thanks, John. So we're going to move into some questions, and what I think I'm going to do is I have some questions I shared with the artists that I'd be asking, and we're not going to have time to ask every single person every question, and I want to kind of move through everyone in sort of an organic capacity while giving everybody equal time. So just kind of hang in there with me. But one of the first questions that I want to ask Kevin, if I may, is what type of planning, problem solving, and decision making goes into your process?
I would say my process is almost 90% planning. I am a meticulous sketcher. I spend a lot of time with my sketchbook. I try my best to pay attention to the weird little daydreams and ideas that I have in my mind, and then try to figure out on paper if they exist outside my mind, but in a tangible form. And if that's something possible, I spend what time I can in the studio trying to bring that to life. But I almost always start with an idea, start with a notion, and it's a lot of free associating, playing around in my mind with materials, with ideas, trying to make connections between things that will make visual sense and physical sense at the same time.
Great, thank you. And while I have you, I also had a question about which sort of piggybacks into your description of your process. But so as far as working intuitively, it's not that you have an idea, but is there some of that plays into your sort of process?
Yes, by intuitive, I kind of equate that with improvising, and improvising to me happens when things don't go as planned. And
yeah.
as careful and as thoroughly as I tend to plan things don't work out most of the time. So there's a lot of flexibility required and a lot of kind of decision making on the fly. And I wish I could say my studio process is just rife with happy accidents and things falling into place. But when that happens, I love it and I embrace it. But the way I work is by sticking to the script, kind of sticking to that plan. And that's something I wish I could learn to think outside of, but I'm working on it.
It's interesting. Thank you. I've always been curious about that with your work. As you know, I love your work. Erin, what about for you? What kind of planning, problem solving, and decision making goes into your process?
Well, I tend to work in a lot of different ways, and a lot of times the processes or parameters I'm setting up have to do with materiality, just to almost make room for improvisation. And so I also like try to do as much as I can to like get myself out, like to free up the paint. Like I paint all the time. I'm not going to stop painting. I have all these other drawing ideas that are ways my brain likes to work, but the best thing they do is they kind of like free the painting up from having to do anything beyond being a painting. So my process tends to be dependent on whatever body of work I'm kind of focused on. So like right now I have 2 or 3 things that are starting, but I don't really know where they're going. So it's just a bunch of material exploration at this point. And then when I lock in into a material, that I'll kind of commit to that material in a way by buying a lot of it and then not letting myself use anything else, and then let the improvisations happen from there.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Eleanor, I'd love to ask you the same question. What type of planning, problem solving, and decision making goes into your process?
Sure. My process has become, I don't know if it's convoluted or ritualistic, or a combination of both, but a lot of these drawings are born from my experiences in various landscapes. And so I am the worst person to hike with because I will take a million reference photos of the ground as, you know, we're walking. And so after I take all these pictures, I'll sort of bring them back into my studio and decide which ones would make, I think, the best drawings. So often, while they're based on reference photos, there's a lot of invention that happens. And so that's, for me, the kind of fun part where I sort of start with the inspiration of, you know, the original photo based on that landscape and the experience of that place, and then reinterpret it in these sort of like hybrid drawing paintings. And so the pen and ink landscape part is less intuitive, I think, than the choices that I make in terms of geometry and colored elements that are superimposed on top. And those to me are much more emotional reflections of my experience of being in the place. And so they're a combination of that, along with occasionally almost like a dream process, right? And just sort of other input that's occurring in my life. And so I really enjoy making these pieces because it is a combination of color and line work and process and intuition. And so while the base drawing is pen and ink, just really basic supplies, the colored elements over top, I'll create a digital file and then a stencil from the digital file to airbrush acrylic paint through. And so that's how I get the nice sort of crisp line work over top. And so the acrylic that is painted on top of these drawings is sprayed using an airbrush. So it's taken a while to kind of perfect the technique and get the ink and the acrylic to work in the way that I want them to work and layer in the correct way. So.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay. Sorry, guys, my questions just left me. So Will, I would love to mix it up a little bit and ask you what your relationship is with your materials.
I've thought a lot about this since I got the question, Melanie. My core materials are paper, canvas, stretchers, paint, acrylics, and gel medium. And I've been using them since 1986. And I switch up my approach to a particular series, which is also how I've always worked. I'm beginning to feel like it's a marriage, my materials and myself. We have our ups and downs, but I trust them, and they have served me well. And my primary interest in the work is how viewers connect to them as textual fields, how they identify with the physical acts that I employed to make them. And that never goes away. So I can add photographs, I can take photographs away, I can tear up surfaces, I'm now using undulating patterns, but it's always back to those core materials, which I will use probably for the rest of my life, but in different ways. So it's a happy marriage.
That's well put. I love that you said at this point you trust in your materials. That's what really, really sticks with me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Max, how about you? What is your relationship with your materials?
My relationship to material is really important. When making a small scale sculpture, I try to choose materials that have a repeating pattern, like pumice stone or the particulates highlighted from a sanded stone or brick.
Mhm.
Some of those qualities of seduction to pull someone's eyes in. I think about walking down a beach in that split second when your eye catches the surface and you reach down to touch it.
Nice. Thank you. And John,
Yes.
you're up. What is your relationship with your materials?
We are intimately related. No, actually, the way I work is initially when I first started to do this series, I just took the photographs, crumpled them together, taped them, and tried to figure out how could I make them freestanding without having to have any sort of support structure inside of them. So the earlier ones are just the paper of the photographs, which is a heavier paper, and then the selection of images. Sometimes I'll select images that are either one color, brightly colored. The images may have something to do with just a theme, but there's usually an underlying decision as to what will actually make that particular sculpture. The other thing I try to do is I try to think of them once I got past the initial stage of using the paper as an element that would stand by itself. Then I started to create images with the books, and the book becomes the core of the sculpture. And then within the photographs are copper tubing swirls and curls that are then covered over with the photographs. So basically, I'm using the photographs as a sculptural element. So I don't know. I'm thinking them as being photographs, but they're also sculpture.
Excellent, thank you. So you're working in the space in between. Great, thank you, everyone. So I think what I'm going to do now is ask another question, and I'm sort of interested in the idea that process is not always revealed in a work of art. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it is not. And so I just thought that maybe you guys could talk to if that's something that you consider that, you know, your process is identifiable within the work that you made once it's made, or, you know, the mystique of the process. Like Eleanor, you had just mentioned about your stencil making of the geometric forms and the overlay and the spray painting. Like that whole process is fabulous to hear, because there's a variety of different ways that you can work like that. So, you know, are you interested in the fact that your process, you know, is clear or mysterious? And just speak to that a little freely, if you would. And I guess Eleanor, maybe we'll start with you, seeing that I just mentioned your work.
I was wondering, yeah. It's interesting because I hadn't actually thought about this question in relationship to my own work before. So I do often think about process in terms of my sculptural work and how a material can record a gesture, right, or a movement, or an action, or something like that. And so I didn't realize that I had been thinking about my drawing work in a similar way, where I think it's sort of written into the layers of the piece, or maybe baked in. I think some of the process is just indicative or indicated by the fact that there are multiple layers to every piece. But I think what's not obvious, and maybe what I would like to keep a little bit more secret, is that these are like based on places that exist. And so I think there's maybe a combination of me wanting to keep some elements secret or mysterious while revealing others. And so the technical aspects I am very comfortable with revealing, but I think the more conceptual or emotional aspects of the piece, I would sort of like to keep those more hidden, which, you know, I thought that question was especially interesting. So I think for me, it sort of breaks down to like technical process and then also the sort of emotional process of making.
Right. No, thank you so much for sharing that. Max, how about same question? And I know I kind of belabored it a little bit, hopefully.
Yeah, I really love that, like the mystery or mystique in process. I've never really thought of that. I like to leave behind certain visual markers that someone was there. You know, how a lot of my pieces will sit on plinths, and some of those plinths are made from manufacturers. So if it's cut brick, there will be a manufacturer's stamp on it, or I'll leave behind, you know, a thumbprint on a band of epoxy there. So there's very small, subtle visual cues, but I really try to keep my work really sharp, because I think there's a great deal of precision when making something that looks organic. And so, you know, when creating my own vocabulary through the objects I'm making, it's not a recognizable object like a cup. I really want them to be polished to the point where, you know, you're kind of happening upon this thing, and it's just there's a certain level of pristine to it.
Excellent. Thank you. Why don't we just take this question across the board? Kevin.
Process is something that I think a lot about, and I struggle a lot with, because I strive for my process to be readily apparent, for the physical process to be there on the surface and for people to understand it. That doesn't always happen, though. Something I encounter oftentimes are people looking at my work and thinking that the manipulations are done in Photoshop rather than the actual artifact that I'm photographing. So that's one point of frustration a little bit, because I think the authenticity of having worked with the materials and manipulated materials makes the voice of the piece a little more authentic. Something I've always responded to in looking at art is to see something and thought to myself that I could have done that. I know a lot of people are really turned off by that when something is very accessible and democratic. But I always love that accessibility that I see in work where there's those fingerprints are visible, the imperfections are visible. And when you look closely, my work is full of those little imperfections that I think help make them feel a little bit more real. I've got one piece I can hold up here, which might illustrate this a little bit, but there's the piece that was shown earlier. It's a photograph with these metal screws.
Oh, wow.
Winding through it, which looks, I've heard people say, well, that's Photoshop, right? You just, you know, cut and paste and you add the drop shadow. Yeah, I could have done that, but wanting it to look more authentic makes the piece a little bit more meaningful to me. And that's something I hope can translate. So I think as more things become possible and easy to do digitally, it's something that I'm going to have to kind of adapt how I struggle with.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Erin. Process and it being revealed in your final work, how important is that to you, or do you think about that at all?
So I think with the paintings, especially, they've taken so long to paint that even though there are processes that I kind of like that they, and I work on so many at the same time, that I kind of like that by the time that they're done or whatever, I've kind of forgotten what I was doing. For me, I think that it's I don't know. I think that sometimes it's an important step. There are times where I really think with whatever concept I'm having, that seeing the process is really important. Like I had a performance that took 6 hours to do, so people were kind of coming in and seeing that process as it was happening, and that felt very like key to what the piece was about. For the paintings, I'm not quite sure that people need to see the processes at the end. Like, I'm not sure how interesting that is to people or what they're getting out of it. I think that they're some kind of way to make me, to get me interested in the work again and again, to push me to some place that is like stays alive in some kind of way, for the paintings to seem alive, I guess. I don't know. That sounds dumb. I really don't, I don't know. I go back and forth. So it kind of depends on the piece by piece, case by case. I definitely think though, like pieces tend to me not be completed until the people see the work, and they're not going to see or know my process at all. And if they come to some kind of different reading, that's fine. So.
Great. Thank you very much. John.
Hi. Yeah. Like I said, my pieces, the sculptural pieces are actually collages because the separate images that comprise each of the sculptures are multiple. And a few years ago, I came across this wonderful book. It's an Annie Albers book, and it's her sketchbook that she did on graph paper from 1970 to 1980. And I loved the book, and I said, you should do that. So what I did was I started to record each sculpture, so these are the separate images that comprise the sculpture that's actually in the window at 5 points. So the sculpture starts out as a flat piece of paper with images that I've selected. In this case, I wanted to use high key color. And then the sculpture is first drawn. So this is like just a quick sketch that I would do of one of the sculptures. I guess you can see that. Then after I do the sketch, then I start to figure out how I'm going to make the sculpture, or the armature of the sculpture. And then once I have the armature of the sculpture, then I start to select images. So for this particular one that is also at 5 points, you can see that there are a lot of different colored images. So each leg of that particular sculpture is comprised of a different color scheme, as well as a different theme for each leg. So that sort of demystifies what I've done. That's it.
That's great. Thank you. Will. Hello, Will.
Hello, Melanie. Since, as I explained before, my process or the viewer's identification with my process is fundamental for my preoccupation with my work. Its centrality can't be overstated. So, however, the way a piece is orchestrated, in other words, how the approaches differ from series to series, allows the work to maintain a certain independence from immediate recognition of process, if that makes any sense at all. Something very magical happens to me when people see the work. I saw this happen in my gallery in Santa Fe all the time. People would inevitably ask if they could touch the surfaces. And that to me signaled an arousal of sense memory, that they identify everybody tears paper up, everybody glues things down, everybody rubs things, right? Whether it be people or things. And this is well, to me, it's almost a redemptive act, a connection, what I call a haptic connection, not just to my to my work and a recognition of my connection, my haptic connection to the work. So it's a full circle, it's a union. So,
Excellent. Thank you, Will. Thank you so much. I think we're just going to try to run through one more question because we want to have enough time to take some questions from the audience. So maybe just really quickly, if everyone can share just how your practice and the process within your practice may have changed over time. And Will, why don't we just start with you?
how my practice has changed over time. It remains enjoyable. But then, as I say, working in series where the approach differs each time has it has enlivened the relationship very much. I would say that the process, it's affected by what's going on around me, certainly, and I like things over which I have no control, and because that makes better work and it makes me better because I have to accept that things are out of my control. So I hope that answers the question in some fashion.
Completely. Actually, astutely. I mean, basically reflecting the life and time that you're living through and your process sort of in response is what I take from that. Thank you. Kevin.
I think as I've grown older and wiser, I've let go of this hope of hitting a home run every single time. And that's become a very liberating thing. I think I felt a lot of pressure to just knock things out of the park every time and to sit on any idea I had that wasn't a complete culmination of all my thoughts and ideas at once. I've let go of that fear a little bit. But at the same time, I feel like I'm not as smart as I used to be. That's really depressing to say. I feel like I used to be really clever and really quick, and I've blended that with other mixes of emotions and approaches, which has also been a growing experience. And also, there's a lot more in my life that I care about now than when I first started making art and getting passionate about art. So those creep in and inform everything I do.
Excellent. Thank you for a thoughtful answer. Erin.
I think that my answer is sort of similar to Kevin's, that I just think that I've just relaxed a little bit. I also have become much more comfortable with the fact that I need to make a lot of work and a lot of it is not very good, and that's okay. And so stop hatching all of this happiness, self-worth to the fact that most of it's going to fail, and just being okay with that fact that that's just part of my process. So
Thanks, Erin. And Eleanor, how has your practice changed over time?
I mean, oh my goodness, talking about failures, right? It's I think we have the pile of things that didn't work that we don't really want to show anybody. But that's really valuable in terms of pushing the studio practice forward. But I mentioned before, my work has become highly ritualized, mainly in the fact of my studio practice, in that I will listen to sort of the same song or the same album for a month when I'm in studio working on a project, probably drive my partner crazy. Or I think just sort of identifying some ways of being more efficient in terms of summoning creativity, which is such a weird thing to think about also, but sometimes sitting in the studio and just sort of looking at the objects that I have around and not really having a clear idea of what I want to make, but being able to sit with that feeling and know that it doesn't mean that I will never make another piece of art again, but that maybe it means I should try something else, right? Or try something different, or take one of those old failures and maybe like Will does, sort of tear it up and see what happens after that, right? And kind of experiment. So sort of in a similar answer to everyone else, I think I have become way more comfortable taking risks in my studio work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. And John, how about you?
Well, in the past, I would always think, how long can I keep doing like one particular project? And inevitably, it just trickles down to, I don't want to do it anymore. And and I always find that there's something that replaces it. I don't feel like distraught. I just keep making stuff all the time. And I don't know how many series I've done. I've done a lot of them. But I guess that there's always some sort of similarity in that I think that collage is one of the things that I always end up using because it allows me to use a lot of different themes, images, colors, and I just like creating different combinations. So combinations are endless. All I have to do is just look through images that I've taken in the past, and I can just bounce off of things and create something new from something old. And I'll look at older work, and sometimes the things that I really despised while I was making them are the things that I love the most after I look at them as time goes by.
I'm sure many of us have a similar
I
thought.
know.
Yeah. Thank
So
you.
somehow I feel like my subconscious knows more about what is right rather than my conscious.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Max.
Yeah.
Last question, and we'll go to the
To echo certain things people have saying, I think over years making, my relationship or vocabulary with material begins to become more fine-tuned and dialed in. There's always a consistent amount of play and exploration that happens, but it's done with a balance. I think of the word precision shaking hands with serendipity. All my work is influenced by the people, places, and objects that I'm drawn to. And as life continues to evolve, so does the work and the questions that I'm asking in my life.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Max. Appreciate it. Everybody, thank you so much. We have one question from a participant, from Catherine Myers. And I guess I will just go ahead and share this question. I'm not sure if you guys can all see it, but it's for, hi, Erin. It must have been heartbreaking to have the Guston show postponed after your immersion in his work for such a long time, but I wonder if you need to see the works, or is your response more of a psychological, emotional connection to the sense of toughness and gentleness in his work?
Well, I think yes, he's Guston, he's wonderful. But I also think that when they first canceled the show, my first response was, that's okay. If it's like a sensitive decision that they came to. And then my second response is, because I think that it's not that they're never having it. The second response that I had, like very, very quickly, was, no, that's not okay. And so I feel like that's kind of where I landed, that it's like, but those reasons for the canceling the show are all political. And for me, that discussion is a very different discussion than what I'm engaging with his work, which is very much, and I think the fact that he can merge painting and politics is what makes him so like how did you do that? when it comes to Guston, aside from just being a painter and a painterly, like it is so wrapped up in growing up in Richmond and seeing these works in a museum, which was my first introduction to painting. And then like, you know, I can remember walking through the BMFA. I remember walking like past the Rothko, past the Motherwell, past, I can like, and then you hit and there's this gigantic goofy Alex Katz painting, which is great. I love it. You'd round the corner and then there's just this giant, ugly pink painting of this giant head and this whip and all these shoes. And I just remember loving it. And then the fact that it was bought by Sydney and Francis Lewis, who owned Best Products, which is where we shopped as kids. And like, it is so wrapped up with growing up and nostalgia and memories, on top of being a painter and just being like, I mean, that show that was at Hauser and Wirth a few years ago was just of those middle with the floating black head things. I mean, that it was, you could like feel the heartbeat in the room. Like it was amazing. So I mean, I love Guston. I think that they're like, I cannot not love him. So, and I think that there's this part of me that, you know, wants to like be like, oh, I hate that I love him so much. But no, he's great. But that feels like a separate conversation than them canceling, which in retrospect just feels like terrible, like just a terrible decision. So, but that feels politics.
Thank you. We have another question for the panelists, no one in particular, from Stephanie Lanter. Wonderful. All artists seem to work with shifting perception in such fascinating ways. I wonder how they would talk about the process of shifting perception. Max, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, and hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much. I love that question. I think a lot about, you know, my work as a nonlinear narrative, and I love to create that moment where you're walking down a street and you see that oil slick pavement, and you stop and you're kind of like, oh wow, that's really stunning, right? Like, let me get a little bit closer and take a photo of that. And so with my objects that I create, these small sculptures, there's a lot of organic elements to them, but then there's, you know, these subtle tones of color that are referencing, you know, queer culture. And so shifting perception, I think that kind of answers the question. You know, something that isn't inherently beautiful, but you're just like, ooh, I want to touch that or put it in my mouth or, you know, bring it home to me with me.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Max. Anybody else want to take a stab at that question? Kevin, yes.
I was thinking about magic recently, and I think I probably heard somebody say this, but what makes a good magic trick is that you want to try to figure out how it works, but at the same time, part of you wants to believe that it's real and that it's unexplainable and it's this this supernatural force. And I think a lot of art deals with wanting to exist on two planes at once, to see what it is for how it was constructed and made and dreamed up by the artist, but then for something bigger and greater as it exists in front of you. And I think to me, some of the most successful art pieces are ones you can stand in front of and kind of bounce back and forth between those two different ways of perceiving and digesting it.
Excellent, thanks, Kevin. Eleanor, you want to give that question an answer, comment?
Sure. Kevin, I love what you just mentioned, and sorry, I was sort of thinking on that still. In that, I think when you're viewing any artwork, there's this sort of suspension of disbelief, right? Because it's like you can look at a drawing and say like, okay, that's like ink on paper. But then there is that sort of magic headspace that you can drop into, right? And in terms of looking at it more deeply or sort of buying into like that image and that sort of magical thinking. So I love that you brought that up. But in terms of my own work, I think a lot of how my perceptions as a human being are necessarily very limited, because if we were able to perceive all of the different sorts of input that were sort of zinging around in the world, we would be really quickly overwhelmed. But in terms of my own artwork, I sort of like to think that I might be getting somewhere close at revealing the sort of hidden aspects of the world, or at least my personal interpretation of how we might be perceiving things slightly differently, each of us, right, in terms of color or in terms of shape, or especially in terms of our life experiences and how we are sort of existing in a specific place or at a specific time.
Thank you, Eleanor. Anybody else? We have a few minutes left. You want to, John?
Yeah, I really like what Kevin said about the magician. That's a great, great idea. And I guess, like with my work in particular, when you asked, or in your series of questions, you asked, do you work intuitively? And I think that ultimately I do work intuitively. And especially in the work that I'm doing now, where I'm drawing over my collages and using a lot of drawing tools where I can manipulate the transparency of the color, the thickness of the line, the shapes. And what I'm really interested in is creating something that I have control over to a degree, and then I just start reacting intuitively, almost completely, and I'm responding to something that I really can't put my finger on. So I think that I'm sort of confounding myself too, because I'm creating something where I'm not really sure where it's coming from. So somehow the magician's in me, but I don't even know how I'm doing the trick.
That's great. Thank you. And Will, why don't you jump in? And
I don't know about the rest of you, but some days for me are hallucinatory. Just being stone cold sober and facing the world, and it's like an acid trip. What is that? And clearly, perception is constant, right? It's our interpretation and the thoughts we assign to those perceptions that then give them weight, give them meaning, give them emotional reverberance, let's say. I've spent many, many years doing my best to not assign meaning to what I see. So it alludes to what Max was talking about. The ugly has equal weight with the beautiful, right? It's all grist for the mill. But to be aware without assessing or judging seems to me a good way to some sort of illuminated life. And it's constant work.
If I could just chime in, Will, that's really beautiful. And this might be opening a can of worms that we don't have time for, but I think about when using, in my own practice, when using that word intuitive, I tend to think of blind hands, making without full cognitive, and I think about curiosity rather than intuition. And I think there is a really fine delineation between the two.
That's really nice. Thank you, gentlemen, ladies. It is 7 o'clock, and I believe that we have run out of time. Does anybody have any final remarks? If not, I encourage everyone to see the show and see it many times over, and get in touch with the artists, or if you have any other further questions. And other than that, I thank you all very much for your time and your thoughtfulness and for participating tonight. It was an honor to be here with you.
Thank you so
Great.
much for doing this, Melanie. It's a
It's
real
my
pleasure
pleasure.
to meet you, and Carl for
Yeah.
coordinating.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you all.
everyone. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
And thank you to everyone who came.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I hope to be in touch with everyone.
Nice to meet all of you.
Nice
Yeah,
to meet you.